My name is Ely, and I've been working as a babysitter for years. Using apps to get odd jobs and make ends meet. I've done some really strange jobs before. Some families were a little sketchy, the houses felt weird, but nothing had ever really kept me up at night. That changed the night I accepted a last-minute assignment through one of those apps I use all the time. The pay was surprisingly high, and the address was in a quiet suburb, almost desolate. To be honest, it gave me a bit of a bad feeling, but I thought it was an opportunity to make some good extra money. The pay was good, and it was only for one night, so what could go wrong? When I arrived, a couple greeted me at the door. They introduced themselves as Claire and Adrian, and they were overly polite, with smiles that stretched wider than normal and movements that seemed rehearsed, which made me a little suspicious. Something about them felt artificial, as if they had practiced a normal version of themselves and still felt uncomfortable. Behind them was a small boy, maybe 8 or 9, pale and almost motionless. I found it a little strange, since children that age are usually very restless, but this one didn't say a word and barely blinked. They told me his name was Tobias and handed me a typed sheet of instructions. Food, allergies, bedtime, all very pampered and routine. But when I asked, "So when are you leaving?" they exchanged a glance and Claire replied, "Oh, we're not leaving, dear. We just need a little peace and quiet down here. You two will have the upstairs to yourselves." That news took me by surprise, but I smiled reluctantly so as not to seem strange, even though the conversation was already making me uncomfortable. I thought maybe they were just eccentric and I didn't want to come across as rude or paranoid, so I just said goodbye and went upstairs with Tobias. As we climbed the stairs, I noticed that the boy was walking slowly, as if afraid to lead the way. His room was immaculate, sterile, almost as if no one had ever lived there. The bed was made too tightly. The toys looked very neat, as if they had been placed there coldly, and there was no TV. I found it too strange, but when I looked at Tobias again, I thought that maybe he had some kind of special condition that made him so neat and tidy. Of course, I didn't ask him directly. I just sat down on a chair and tried to strike up a conversation with him, suggesting cartoons or asking about his favorite shows. He didn't say anything, just stared at the door. His eyes didn't blink much and his expression didn't change, but I kept trying to chat with him about simple things, how my day had been, my cat, school, anything to get him to respond. But he barely moved. After almost an hour of trying to connect with him in some way, the little boy looked at me and whispered, "They're not my real parents." I blinked a couple of times, not sure if I had heard him correctly. "What are you saying?" I whispered, and he repeated it quietly, then said, "They keep people. You're one of them now." My stomach lurched and I froze. I wanted to think it was a joke, that he was just making things up, but there was no humor in his voice. No smile, no blinking, just fear. At that moment, I got up, ran to the door, and turned the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was wrong. I started banging on it, calling for Claire and Adrian, shouting that the door was stuck and to open it now, but I got no response. A few seconds passed, and when they finally opened it, they were there, standing, smiling as if nothing had happened, with the same rehearsed smile they had when I arrived. "Is something wrong, Ely?" I looked at Tobias, then at them. "It's just that he said they weren't really his parents." Claire's smile didn't fade, and then she replied, "And you believe them?" "We closed the door, dear, in case he has a panic attack and wants to run away. He sometimes does." I was very confused at that moment. I had a knot in my stomach and a feeling in my body that told me something was wrong, so I told them I didn't feel safe and wanted to leave. Claire's eyes didn't soften, but her tone was condescending. "Calm down, Ely, everything will be fine. You're just overwhelmed, dear." I was about to tell her that I would decline the job offer, but the words died in my mouth as she pulled a huge kitchen knife from behind her back. She didn't threaten me directly with it, but the message was clear. "It would be better if you could stay with Tobias a little longer," she said without wiping that fake smile off her face. My hands began to shake and I slowly backed away while Adrian stepped forward and closed the door again with a loud click. That sound sent chills down my spine. My heart began to beat very fast. Desperate, I ran to the window and tried to open it, but it was sealed shut. That's when I saw the metal bars on the outside. Thick, permanent bars. Tobias wasn't lying. I was locked in. I was a prisoner. I tried to calm down and find a solution, so I sat on the bed and tried to call someone, but there was no signal, no Wi-Fi, not even a fake emergency line. My God, what is this? I muttered, feeling like I was about to lose my mind. At that moment, I turned to Tobias and asked, "Why are they doing this?" He looked at me with a mixture of fear and condescension and said, "They like to hold people back. They say it's for company, but sometimes it's worse. Sometimes they give me things that make me sleep. I stopped counting a long time ago." Panic hit me in waves, and I didn't know what to do. I tried to calm down, but my breathing was ragged and my skin felt cold. To make matters worse, I remembered that I hadn't told anyone where I was going, so no one would come looking for me. I started pacing around the room, touching the walls, looking for a possible exit, but there was nothing. Just the closed door, the barred window, and Tobias still motionless, looking at me as if he already knew how this would end. And after what seemed like hours, I found a small metal nail clipper in my backpack. It was the only sharp object I had, and therefore the only possible weapon I could use in case of necessity. I held it in my hand, testing how hard I could press it against my skin, and well, it quickly became clear that it wouldn't do much damage, but it was better than nothing, so I hid it inside my sleeve and waited. Eventually, the lock clicked and the door opened. Claire came in with a tray of food and a glass of juice. Her voice was sweet, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't threatened me with a knife and kidnapped me into her house. "You're doing a great job, dear. We'll need you a little longer." I didn't answer. Instead, I approached Tobias, grabbed him quickly, and pressed the nail clippers against his neck. "Let me go or I'll hurt him." My grip was weak and my voice cracked, but I hoped the fear of me hurting him would be enough. Tobias began to cry, trembling in my arms, but Claire's face didn't change. She just gently set the tray aside, as if nothing had happened, and then Adrian entered the room and with the same serene smile said to me, "That's not the way to solve things, Ely." They both moved closer and closer to me, so I began to panic. I threatened to hurt Tobias again, but they didn't care at all, so I finally pushed him away and ran towards the door, but Adrian grabbed me mid-stride and threw me against the wall. The pain shot through my shoulder like lightning, and to make matters worse, Claire picked up the nail clippers and stabbed me in the back. I screamed in pain and tried to get up and run away from them, but they dragged me back and Claire whispered in my ear, "We have rules here, Ely, and you broke them." She pulled my hair and forced me to look at Tobias. "Apologize." He was looking at me with a disappointed expression, which made me feel even worse. "I'm sorry," I said to Tobias, and Adrian nodded in approval. Then they grabbed my arm and dragged me down the hall. There, they opened a door hidden behind a bookcase, revealing a staircase leading into the darkness. They pushed me down without hesitation, and I hit the stairs, rolling until I hit the concrete floor. My ribs hurt like hell. The basement smelled of mold, metal, and something much worse: decay. It was completely dark, but I could make out silhouettes. In one corner, 2 women were tied to the wall, chained. I was in shock. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. So I wasn't the only one being held captive at that moment. One was motionless and the other looked at me with empty eyes. She was very thin and barely alive. I crawled closer, trying not to scare her, and she recoiled, clinging to the chain as if I were another threat. Her skin was too pale and her arms were covered in faded scars. Her condition was so terrible that my heart sank when I saw her. I whispered, "Are you okay?" trying not to scare her, but she didn't respond. I realized that she probably hadn't spoken to anyone in days or weeks, maybe even months. The other body didn't move at all. Her mouth was open and her limbs were stiff, and she already smelled bad. It was clear that she had been dead for some time. My God, I think that image is going to haunt me forever. I found a corner and sat there trembling. I don't know how much time passed, but I tried to stay awake, counting seconds and reciting songs in my head, until sleep simply overcame me. I have no idea how many days I was there, surviving on only water and the occasional piece of bread Claire gave me. The woman nearby muttered unintelligible nonsense from time to time, but she didn't eat and barely touched the water. I tried several times to approach her to get her to eat and drink something, but she panicked and wouldn't let me. One day Claire came down and gave her a flower. "You're still my favorite, dear," she whispered. That same night, the woman passed away quietly. I think she gave up on life. I was next. I could feel my body slowly shutting down. My stomach hurt constantly and I barely had the strength to sit up. Then one night I heard a loud bang upstairs. I tried to listen carefully, and I could clearly make out people running, shouting, and finally, a crash. Adrian came into the basement with a gun in his hand and looked terrified. "Don't talk," he shouted at no one in particular. Then he ran back upstairs, and that's when I heard the most hopeful sound in the world. "Police! If anyone is down there, speak up!" That voice was like a burst of energy running through my body and bringing me back to life. I screamed so hard that my throat burned, and just a few seconds later, a flashlight beam hit my face. Footsteps came quickly down the stairs. "She's alive," someone shouted, and soon a pair of hands grabbed me, cutting the chain. I fainted in an officer's arms. I was too weak to stand and too numb to speak. They carried me outside and into an ambulance. The cool night air felt unreal. The cold night wind stung my face. I saw lights, people, flashing sirens. A doctor asked me questions, but I couldn't answer. I just stared at the trees, blinking slowly, feeling as if I were dreaming. At the hospital, they cleaned my wounds, fed me, and treated the infections. A detective came by later, and that's when I learned what had happened. Tobias had escaped while Claire and Adrian were asleep. He found a loose vent and crawled through it, running barefoot through the woods until he reached a gas station where he told the clerk everything, and the clerk called the police. The police didn't believe him at first, but then he showed them his bruises, and that made them act immediately. I couldn't believe it. That child saved my life. Even after everything, he was brave enough to do what I couldn't. He never screamed. He never ran while I was there. He waited, watched, and acted when he had the chance. Claire was injured during the rescue, but she survived long enough to confess everything. She and Adrian had kidnapped at least 6 women over the years. Some were nannies, and others were strangers. 3 bodies were confirmed, and 2 were never found. She and Adrian are now facing trial. Although I stopped following the news, I don't want to know anything else. I spent weeks in the hospital and recovery was slow. All of this left me deeply traumatized, and it took me months to be able to sleep with the lights off. I still check every lock in the house twice or more. Sometimes I have nightmares about Claire where I see her smiling and holding that same flower. I wake up screaming and my heart is racing. I no longer go near unfamiliar houses or take babysitting jobs. Never again. Tobias was placed with a new family, and I saw him once from a distance as he walked through the park with his new parents. He recognized me and smiled, and I, of course, smiled back. That brave little angel is the only reason I'm alive today, and I'll never forget that. Once, out of pure curiosity, I started researching how much the human body is really worth on the black market, and I was shocked by what I found. It turns out that on average, a complete body can be worth around $46 million. Imagine that. Just a heart can be worth close to $1 million. Each kidney is around $262,000, and the liver, which is not far behind, is around $557,000. I don't know why, but whenever I share this information with someone, their reaction is always the same. That weird look on their face, as if I had told them something crazy. They look at me as if I were saying I have a flying robot or something. and they wonder why I have all that macabre information in my head. But the truth is, it's not that I like that crap, it's not that I have some morbid interest in organs. It's just that, in a way, life forced me to learn those things. It was something I simply had to know, beyond my control. I never planned it, but that's how I ended up knowing how much organs are worth on the black market, and to understand why, I have to tell you the whole story, okay? It's a story that began a long, long time ago, on a day I'll never forget, April 15th, 1996. That day was my 5th birthday. When you're little, birthdays are usually happy, right? Well, in my case, that day started out special, but it soon turned into the worst thing that ever happened to me. I was in my backyard running around with my mom playing with a robot she had bought me a few days earlier. To be honest, it was a pretty cool toy, and I liked to have it with me all the time, but suddenly I felt a strange dizziness, something I couldn't quite explain. I started to feel a kind of twinge in my chest, and within seconds I fell to the ground. I remember being taken immediately by ambulance to the hospital. I couldn't feel my hands or feet, and it was as if someone had stabbed me in the chest with a spear, with a pain so intense that I couldn't explain it. My mom and dad were in shock, trying to stay strong, but they were also scared. I was so young that I could hardly understand what was happening. I just felt that horrible pain and the feeling that my heart was going to explode. They ran several tests, but soon the bad news came. My heart was no longer responding the same way. The doctor explained that my problem was more serious than they thought, and that, unfortunately, the complications were getting worse by the minute. That day, my childhood slipped away, and it was almost certain that I would spend it in a hospital. Most of the doctors didn't think I would make it, but there was one in particular who didn't give up. My dad, Richard Coulson. I rarely saw him when I was a child because his job was very demanding. He was a surgeon specializing in everything related to the heart, lungs, and that part of the body that can make you feel so alive or so dead. My dad's job involved long days and long hours, even on weekends and holidays. Sometimes he couldn't even be home for birthdays, but one day I realized that he was still my hero, even if he wasn't always there. I understood the dedication his job required from a very young age, and I didn't complain. My mom, who always took great care of me, told me that Dad was away because he was saving lives, and that was something that made him special. In reality, I didn't know if I would ever understand that one day. That job would save mine too. My dad took my heart problem very seriously. He took care of all my treatment himself and was always by my side whenever he could, even in the hardest moments. Many times during those long hours in the hospital, he would bring me toys or read me books to calm me down. It was as if, in the midst of all that darkness, he was my light. I rarely thought about how much I missed him when he couldn't be with me, and to me, he was more than my dad. He was my hero and my protector. Thanks to him, I wasn't bedridden for the rest of my life. His care and constant work kept my heart pumping. But of course, it wasn't all easy. Although it seemed that life was giving me a chance, I was never out of danger. I couldn't do intense physical activities, and I had regular checkups to make sure everything was still in order. My dad did everything he could so that I could go to school and live as normal a life as possible, and little by little, things got better. I was able to finish high school without any major problems, and I felt that perhaps my destiny had changed. But life always has surprises, and in reality, what came next would be even more terrible. At 18, after many years in the hospital, my heart began to deteriorate again. The situation became so serious that my only lifeline seemed to be a transplant. At that moment, life became a kind of nightmare, and that's when I really learned how much an organ is worth on the black market. The waiting list was long, and the chances of finding a donor were almost nil, so I had no choice but to do some research. And that's how I discovered that a heart can cost approximately $1 million on the illegal market. Of course, that wasn't something we could pay for overnight, and even though my dad was doing everything he could to get help, we couldn't afford that amount even if we wanted to. Organ sales are illegal, and the risk of such an operation was extremely high. I knew that even if I survived the surgery, my life expectancy would only be about 9 to 11 years. The truth is that it seemed like everything was over for me, and despair overwhelmed me. But my dad wasn't willing to give up. He used his medical contacts to find a donor, and although he was on the verge of giving up several times, he didn't give up, and against all odds, just when hope seemed lost, he managed to find someone compatible. A patient who, for some reason, was willing to donate his organ and sacrifice himself for me. He performed the operation himself, which was a heroic act. When they found out what had happened, the entire medical and journalistic community praised him as a hero. The truth is, that operation completely changed my life. I was given a second chance, and I was able to go to college and start over. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe, that I could have a future. I was happy and finally hopeful that everything would be different. But of course, things are never that simple. Just when I thought I could rest, life dealt me another hard blow, and everything started to go wrong again. All this happened during my first years at university, just after I returned from summer vacation. I noticed something strange about my mom. She, who had always been the happiest and strongest woman, started acting differently. She was quieter than usual, and when I asked her what was wrong, she started crying. At first, I had a hard time convincing her to talk, but in the end, she told me what was making her nervous. She saw my dad come home after a long shift with a lot of cash in his hands, and she couldn't help but think that maybe that money was from something illegal. At first, she thought they were just withdrawing cash to put in the safe as they had done before, but in recent months that story had been repeated several times, and each time, her suspicion grew. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore and asked my dad where all that money was coming from, but he always avoided answering. His excuse was that it was all for investments in state-of-the-art medical equipment, and that there was nothing more to it than that. But I knew something wasn't right. That night, after he went to bed, I decided to investigate on my own, so I went into his office, which was always locked, and managed to find the laptop that was there. He had left it on, and to my surprise, the screen was locked. But I used the same password he always used for everything, his birthday. And when I managed to log in, what I saw was worse than anything else. There was a web page open with an address I didn't quite recognize. Oregone.union. The word onion popped into my mind, and I remembered that years ago, while exploring the dark web with a friend, I had come across those kinds of sites, which end in .onion. I always thought they were very dangerous, and now I realized why. What I saw on that page was a series of images that made me want to vomit. Human organs cut into various parts, all scattered around that kind of digital black market. There were hearts, livers, kidneys, all displayed as if they were products in a store, and under each photo were the prices in Bitcoin. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Those images got to me deep down, and I couldn't stop thinking about what kind of things my dad was involved in. My head started spinning, repeating over and over again how far human evil can go in that dark and sinister market. I couldn't understand it, but I knew I had gone too far and that probably my life and that of my family were in serious danger. But before I could come to any conclusions, just then a message started appearing on the laptop. It was from a woman named Mia, and what it said left me frozen. "Please return my brother's body intact to our family, Dr. Coulson. I don't remember my brother signing that organ donor card that you claimed he had signed, and I didn't make that offer to you. You didn't inform me or anyone else in my family that he wanted to donate." At that moment, I knew everything fit together. I didn't need to see anything else because I already understood what was going on. I had reached a point where everything I had seen and read completely chilled me, and now it confirmed that the guy I always thought was an exceptional man and an honorable surgeon was, in fact, a monster. As I continued to review the text messages on his phone, I found even worse things. There were a series of conversations with several patients' families, And in those conversations, my dad, the famous Dr. Coulson, seemed to have no remorse for what he was doing. One thread in particular caught my attention. It was from a man named Mr. Howard, and in that message, he accused him of mutilating the corpse of his daughter, who had died under strange circumstances. My dad's response was brutal. He told him that his daughter had voluntarily signed the donor card at the hospital, and that he had no right to accuse him of anything. He told him that his daughter had wanted to do it to help others, and that he didn't understand why he wanted her organs to rot in the ground instead of saving lives. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I felt my stomach turn and everything in my head started spinning. I wondered if I had ever really known the man who called himself my father, because that response, those words, that way of speaking was nothing like the person I had in mind. It was as if my whole life was a lie. Tears began to well up, and just when I felt most lost, I heard footsteps in the hallway approaching the office. I tried to run out before I was discovered, but in my desperation, I tripped over a medium-sized cooler that was nearby, and just then, with a horrible noise, I saw a couple of kidneys and a heart roll out of the cooler onto the floor. The scene was so intense that I couldn't take it anymore. It was as if all the filth my dad was involved in had exploded in my face. At that moment, without being able to help myself, I started vomiting, throwing up everything I had eaten that morning and all the fear that was rising in my chest. My dad walked into the office at that moment, and when he saw the mess, he knew immediately what had happened. What I saw in his eyes was pure guilt, pure condemnation. He wanted to try to explain himself, but I couldn't listen to him anymore. The truth is, it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life. Running out of there at that moment, without looking back so I wouldn't get caught up in that scene of madness. But something inside me told me that I couldn't go on living like that, with that weight on my conscience and on my soul. So, without thinking twice, I called the police. The revelations were monstrous for everyone involved in that investigation. No one could believe that the most respected doctor, the one everyone admired and whom I was once proud of, was capable of such horrors. Over the following weeks, the police discovered that my father was a key player in an organ trafficking network operating on the dark web. Not only did he extract organs from corpses and dying patients without their consent, but he also manipulated families, forcing them to sign documents under threat or coercion. Worst of all, he often forged signatures, and in some cases mutilated and stole organs from corpses in the morgue. The rush to sell them on the black market was such that they only had a few hours before the organs deteriorated and became impossible to sell at a profit. He told his partners to post open offers on that part of the dark web, where buyers sent bitcoins and then quickly and clandestinely picked up their merchandise. All that terrible business, that network of horror came to light, and my dad ended up in prison. He was sentenced to 22 years for all those horrible crimes. The last time I saw him alive, he was being led away in handcuffs, and the look on his face still haunts me. I can't get it out of my head. That scene and those words still torment me. My family, after all that disaster, almost fell apart. But my mother, with great effort, managed to keep us together and move forward. Truthfully, I don't know how she did it. She was the one who sustained us in the midst of all that darkness. For my part, I still have nightmares from time to time, the kind that seem to never let me sleep peacefully. They are recurring images. The operating room, my parents' faces, that heart beating in my chest, and the face of the monster that was my dad, in reality, a criminal. I've been through many therapy sessions, trying to understand how someone with the face of a loving father could do such horrible things. But with each passing day, I feel that guilt eating away at me. I can't help thinking about the person whose heart he stole, that heart that now beats inside me, on the left side, in the same place that belonged to someone else before. That idea never leaves me alone. It's as if the weight of that innocent blood is still on my hands, on my chest, on my soul. That in reality, it wasn't just a crime against that family, but also against me, against what my life could have been if those horrors hadn't crossed my path. Hi, I'm John, and today I want to tell you something that still haunts me. A story that, even though it happened years ago, still gives me chills every time I remember it. It's about the day I met one of the most dangerous and feared men ever accused of killing children in history. Most people know him as David Carter, but others call him the Atlanta Killer, or simply the Cricket. To be honest, I always had my doubts because I never knew if it was that guy or if it was someone else. What I do know is that night, that man stole something from me that I will never get back, and that continues to haunt me to this day. But don't worry. If you still don't quite understand what I'm talking about, don't worry. I'm going to tell you all about it now. It may have been more than 40 years since that night, but for me it feels like yesterday. My memory doesn't fail me on that, and I can still clearly remember every detail, every sensation, every sound. I was only about 10 at the time, but everything that happened that night was etched in my mind. The truth is, I don't remember much about that time in general, but that particular night remained etched in my mind as if it were a memory from another world. When I think about all this, I'm still surprised how at such a young age I was able to understand in a way what was at stake. My family lived in a small house on the outskirts of town. My dad worked in a factory, and he had an old typewriter in the dining room where he spent hours typing and filling out papers. My mom, on the other hand, worked shifts at a small shop in the city center. When she had to go out, my dad always came to pick me up and take me home, and most of the time in the car, we would talk or sing a song and everything seemed normal, like any other day. But at that time, my older brother Daniel, who was 15, already thought he was too old to be looked after. So sometimes, when my dad left, he preferred to spend his time playing video games or watching TV in the dining room, while I continued with my little plastic soldiers in my room. One night, like any other, my dad left and my brother stayed watching TV. I was still armed with my soldiers, placing each one in position, when suddenly I heard a noise outside my room. It was a loud bang on the window, and at that moment I thought it was a branch or a bird. But when I turned my head, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In front of me, at the window, was a guy. I don't know if he was very tall or very short, but his presence was intimidating and terrifying. He had a crooked smile on his face, but in reality it wasn't just any smile. His teeth were shining and his face was trembling, as if he were anxious or desperate. His eyes were filled with brutal anxiety, and each knock on the window seemed louder and more intense. It was as if he wanted to get in at all costs. At that moment, I could only stand there, paralyzed, unable to move. The man from the window waved at me, as if asking me to open the window for him. My first instinct was to run away, scared to death, and that's what I did. I jumped up and ran to the dining room where my brother was, and told him what I had seen. When he heard me, he quickly got up and came to check my room, but to our surprise, there was no one there. The guy who had looked at me through the window with that strange and dangerous face was gone. He never came back, and that reassured us at the time, although we were still very scared. Luckily, my brother believed me and told me that he had probably already left, that I shouldn't worry, and that if he came back I should let him know. But he made it very clear to me that I shouldn't open the window, that I had to behave myself, and that if the man came back I should let him know and not listen to anyone else. For a few minutes I thought my brother was absolutely right, so I stayed still, not knowing what to do, and just then I decided to go with him to the living room just in case. I was very afraid to be alone in my room after that experience. My brother and I sat down in the living room, but before I could even sit down on the sofa, he stopped me with his hand. When I looked at him, his face was pale and panic was reflected in his eyes. He was completely terrified. And no wonder, because just then, right in front of us, the main patio door was open. And there he was, standing in front of the entrance, the same guy from the window, the one who had greeted me with that smile for so long. He was staring at us, saying nothing. After a few uncomfortable seconds, he raised his hand and greeted us again, as if he were an old friend. Do you understand me? It was as if that guy wanted us to know that he was going to come in and that he didn't care that we were scared. My heart was racing, and despite everything, I knew that this man was not a normal person. He couldn't be. He was filled with a very dark energy. I felt it deep down. And more than that, it was very clear that he wanted to hurt us. I had no choice but to stand there, paralyzed, feeling fear take hold of me, cutting off my breath, until suddenly that man began to walk slowly toward the door, still smiling, and with that expression that I can't describe, even now. My brother saw him and without thinking twice got up and ran to the window, grabbing the flashlight we always kept on the nightstand. We exchanged a quick glance, and just then my brother shouted, "Let's call the police, tell them there's a problem here." In the midst of the chaos, I tried to run out into the street to get help. The neighbor's house was only a few steps away, and I knew that if I got there I could ask for help. Behind me I saw that the man stood still for a moment, as if he were evaluating whether to follow me or not. But right then, my brother hit him on the head with the flashlight, very hard and treacherously. That distracted the guy for a moment, and I took the opportunity to run away, although I was very worried about my brother. As soon as I got to the neighbor's house, I explained everything that had happened, and they immediately called the police. Within minutes, my parents and the police arrived at the house, but when they entered, the house was empty. The guy was gone, no trace of him. But that reassured me because I couldn't find my brother either. The search lasted for days and days throughout the area, and although they checked every corner, they couldn't find even a clue about that horrible guy. But unfortunately, they did find my brother, or at least what was left of him. I clearly remember when they told me that this man, this monster, had not only killed my brother, but had left his body in a ditch near the house. They had found him lying there, lifeless. He was in his underwear and still had a look of fear on his face. At that moment, everything inside me began to fall apart. Those days were the worst of my life, not only for me, but also for my parents. There are no words to describe what it feels like to lose someone this way, and even more so when the situation in which it happened was so terrifying. We never got over that loss, and above all, the uncertainty of not knowing if the man who killed my brother was still out there, free, doing the same thing to others. A few years later, a man named David Carter, known as the Atlanta Killer, was finally arrested and charged with killing more than 20 children, including my brother. Justice, to a certain extent, did its job, and finally my parents were able to close that horrible chapter of their lives. But I swear, I still have a lot of doubts. When I had to identify him in prison, in court, I wasn't entirely sure that this was the man who took my brother. I said yes, but in reality, I felt like I was forced to say that. The truth is, that man's face is blurred in my memories, as if my mind wanted to erase that image. I only know that somewhere deep down there is a very dark and horrible memory of a demon who took my brother away cruelly and without remorse. And so, after so many years, I still wonder if it was really that guy who took my brother away from us. Because to be honest, I have the feeling that justice was perhaps never fully served, that there is still something they don't want to tell us. The doubt remains, and it won't let me rest. Today, more than 45 years later, my brother would have turned 60, and every day, every night, I wonder what our lives would be like if things had been different. What would it have been like to have him here, helping me in school, accompanying me in my achievements with his laughter and his difficult character? Or what would it have been like to see him get married, have his own children? But instead, I was left with a huge void, with that feeling that something was never quite finished, that something was left undone. Worst of all, the very person who ruined our lives could still be free. And that gives me nightmares, keeps me awake at night, and makes me think about what might have happened if that day had not been like that. Because what hurts me the most, what I can never forget, is that I still don't know if there was real justice, if that horrible face I have in my head was the end of the torment. All I know is that I still have a lot inside me that I can't clarify, and that dark figure in my memory is a shadow that will never completely go away. I always thought I was a lucky girl. At 25, I had a stable job, a group of supportive friends, and most importantly, an amazing boyfriend named Daniel. We met in college, and since then, our relationship blossomed. 3 years together seemed like a perfect world, but as in any horror story that begins happily, there is always a shadow lurking, and in this case, I had no idea of the storm that was about to come into my life. One night in October, after a lovely dinner, we decided to watch a movie at home. The atmosphere was perfect: dim lights, popcorn, and the soft sound of rain hitting the window. What could be better? As we were snuggled up on the couch, something suddenly popped into my head out of nowhere. I asked Daniel about his ex-girlfriend, Freya. I had heard vague rumors that she had disappeared years ago, but the subject had never come up between us. Daniel was silent for a moment, and his expression turned cold. Then he blurted out, "I don't want to talk about it," which made me feel a little uncomfortable, but I understood. This was surely difficult for him. However, my curiosity led me to insist a little more and ask him if he had any memories of her. He looked at me with a mixture of disdain and sadness and finally said, "It was a bad chapter in my life. I've forgotten about it." For some reason, I couldn't get the matter out of my head that night. And the next morning, my uneasiness prompted me to do some research on my own. With just a few clicks on the computer, I came across Freya's story. She had disappeared more than 4 years ago, and even though her family had done everything possible to find her, they had never discovered her whereabouts. It was clear that she had left a void in the hearts of her loved ones, and I felt my heart sink as I read the words her mother had dedicated to her, still holding out hope that she would find her one day. That afternoon, I met up with my friends and we went to a cafe, and while we were chatting about this and that, I mentioned the subject to them, but their reactions were confused. "Are you sure it had nothing to do with him? Isn't there something strange about Daniel?" they asked me. I hadn't thought about it, but of course not. Everyone loved him. How could there be anything dark behind those sweet eyes? Over the next few days, the idea settled in my head like a shadow. I began to notice small details. His behavior became stranger and more impulsive. But I tried to convince us, well, myself, that I was exaggerating. However, fear began to take its place in my daily life. One night, while reading a book in bed, I heard a noise coming from the closet. It was a strange sound, as if something was moving, but Daniel was in the living room. My heart began to beat fast, but I decided to ignore it. However, my uneasiness kept me awake. The following week, I heard it again, the same sound. That night, I gathered my courage and went to the closet. I opened the door and looked inside, and as I expected, there was just a pile of messy clothes. I thought I was going crazy, but before closing it, I noticed something strange. One of the walls at the back of the closet seemed to have a different texture, as if the wood was worn and slightly raised. I looked back again, making sure Daniel wasn't in the room, and took a closer look, then discovered that the wall was moving slightly. Everything in me told me I shouldn't do it, but I was compelled to push the wall, and to my horror it moved, and I found a hole behind it. I don't know how to describe what I felt at that moment, but my survival instinct screamed at me to stop. However, I moved a little closer. I could barely breathe at that moment, and what I saw simply froze my blood. It was like a hiding place behind the wall, and there in that small space was something wrapped in thick, worn fabric. Without thinking, I took the object and pulled it out of that place, and when I unfolded the cloth, I realized it was a thick winter coat, A coat that was stiff, cardboard-like, and smelled horrible, like a rotten animal, but I soon realized that it wasn't just a coat, it was tied like a bag, and there was something inside. At that moment, my heart was racing. I had a clear idea in my mind of what could be there, but I tried to deny it with all my strength. However, when I pulled the coat out of the closet, my worst fears materialized, and my world fell apart. As I untied the coat, a nauseating smell immediately emanated from it, but the most terrifying part was yet to come. An almost mummified human head with long red hair rolled out of the fabric, and my heart stopped. Now there was no doubt. What I found that night in the closet was Freya's dismembered corpse. A sharp scream escaped my lips as the truth dawned on me, deep and terrifying before my eyes. But at that moment I heard footsteps on the stairs and my heart leapt. Now I was completely terrified, and knowing what I had done to Freya, I wasn't going to stay and confront him, but I didn't know what to do either. I was desperate and panicking as Daniel's footsteps approached the room. In a desperate act, I grabbed the lamp from the nightstand and hid behind the door. Daniel came in and called my name, and at that moment I thought about hitting him with the lamp. But I didn't have the heart to do it, so I just ran down the stairs. As I was stepping onto the last step, I heard him curse and call my name, but of course I ignored him, and by the time he came down the stairs, shouting my name furiously, like the psychopath he was, I had already started the car and was speeding off to the police station. When the police arrived at the house, they found the coat with Freya's remains, but there was no trace of him. The autopsy revealed that Freya had been strangled and then dismembered, after which Daniel had put her remains in his own coat and hidden them in a secret compartment behind his closet. It took 4 weeks before Daniel was caught and taken to prison, and during that time I was under police protection. I was terrified and in shock. No one could believe what had happened, but beyond the fear and trauma of knowing that for 3 years I'd been sleeping just a few feet away from Freya's corpse, and that my sweet Daniel was actually a cold-blooded killer, there was the pain of losing him. My heart was broken into pieces, and it took me more than 3 years to start dating again. I never spoke to Daniel again, and I probably never will, as he was sentenced to life in prison